So first of all, I apologize that I was not with you for the earlier parts of this meeting. Unfortunately, some high priority things popped up that I wasn't able to control. And so you have me sort of at the end here wondering what happened for the last day and a half. So I may say things that are repetitive, and if you find them to be so, you should just say so, and I'll go on to the next topic. Second, I would invite discussion, although everybody here I hope knows I'm hearing impaired, so I didn't mean to come to be the guy that came to talk and didn't listen, but I might have to get some help to understand some of the questions or statements. Let me start out, first of all, by saying that we've been a strong supporter of David's work, Freedom to Connect, and other similar activities, partly because the freedom to connect has been reducing lately, not going up, despite the fact that there's been fairly dramatic growth in the internet all around the world. But at the same time that growth has occurred, there has also been a substantial amount of pressure coming from a variety of sources to try to limit what people are allowed to do using this very fundamental infrastructure. There is evidence of that in several different places. The most startling for me, most recent and startling, is this copyright alert system that I hope some of you, was that discussed during the week or during the, it wasn't, okay, so.
Six strikes?
I'm sorry?
6 strikes?
6 strikes, yes, okay, that instead of 3, Hadopi in France. What this is something that I gather must have been cooked up by the intellectual property community. I use the word community very lightly here. I have other descriptors which I won't use in public. But their idea is to turn the internet service provider community, at least in the United States, into a police force to observe whether or not you are violating copyright. Now, you must imagine that the mechanisms by which they are likely achieving this, and I don't have any details that I can relate, so I am speculating here, but deep packet inspection comes to mind, examination of the destination IP addresses come to mind, considering that they often run the resolvers, it's possible that the resolvers are keeping track of things, I don't know. But there's obviously a fair amount of analysis that would have to be done about your traffic in order to decide there's an issue. And if they conclude that, that you are obtaining or generating material which is under copyright for which you do not have the right to either retrieve or to disperse, if they detect this, they will take action. And at some point, it escalates. Maybe David can say, if after you get to the 6th strike, do they disconnect you from the network? We don't know. Okay. So let's take this as a homework assignment. Those of you who feel as strongly as I do anyway about the importance of being able to use the internet pretty much any way you want to. I'm not advertising illegality here, but I am saying that people should be free to do things that are within the realm of legality at their own choice. Let's do some homework and find out how this actually works and what kinds of enforcement and what kinds of penalties are proposed. Now, this is 2013. Many of you will remember 2012 and the January 18th blackout and the defeat of the pursuit of the PIPA and SOPA legislation. Some people don't agree with my analysis, but I suggest to you that part of the reason that the resistance worked is that it was an election year. And the supporters of those bills were in competition with others who sought their seats. And those opponents used the PIPA and SOPA legislation as a political tool to say, don't vote for that person, that incumbent, vote for me because that incumbent is trying to shut down your rights. As soon as it was clear that this was a politically toxic topic, everybody ran away. 2013 is not an election year. These bills or something like them will return. And some of the leverage that our community had in trying to shut down that legislation was a consequence of the election politics, which we will not have as a lever during 2013. 2014 is coming up. Of course, it will be an election year, at least for some portion of both the Senate and the House. But I want you to be conscious of the fact that we can't beat our chests and say, look how terrific and powerful we are, without understanding the nature of the leverage that we exercise. I think Elliot's point about voting with your feet and with your wallet is a very good one, and that's a powerful meme that we shouldn't forget. But some of these things have little to do with money, and they have a great deal to do with politics. There is also, in my view, a serious lack of competition. There is, at least in the broadband sector, it continues to concentrate, and certainly at least in the United States. We're seeing some pretty interesting experiments, especially the one in Australia, where the government has decided to pay for the cost of putting fiber in all over the country. I think this is going to be a very important exercise to follow, to see whether or not the side effect of that is in fact going to be an ignition of GDP growth because people have access to and can compete with each other for the use of that underlying facility. When I look at the situation with the American U.S. Postal Service, which is losing money and shutting down possibly delivery, and well, in fact, it is delivery on Saturday. I guess it's supposed to be shut down in August of this year. Other facilities are likely to be shut down. I get worried when I see that happening because that's sort of a fundamental infrastructure, the ability to deliver something at a reasonable cost to some destination. Now, of course, we have competitors like DHL and FedEx and UPS and the like, but they're pretty expensive services. And the best bargain in the world, maybe it was too much of a bargain, given the economics, has always been the ability to post a letter. That whole business is starting to crater because so much of the first-class mail stream is going online. But that doesn't mean that everything can be sent online. We haven't quite got the matter transmitters and the transporters working, and the ones I've seen anyway have little checksum errors, and you come in inside out, and it's not a good thing. So until that actually gets fixed, we really need an infrastructure that can do physical delivery. So I am very worried that the path that we're on right now is in fact eroding what should be a national infrastructure. And I think we could worry a little bit about the commercial side of things, commercial services for access to internet. There's a fair amount of competition in the wireless space, but once again, my concern there is that it isn't very open. Not so much in the sense of admitting new competitors, but more in the sense of what you can do with the devices that you get, that you pay dearly for. And once again, the lock on the device and the limits as to what applications can be run is still concerning to me. I like the notion of an application that finds crappy apps and gets rid of them, as we could call that CRAP, C-R-A-P-P, and that could now become a new service that somebody could offer. Now, our problem in terms of legislation is not confined to the domestic scene. Those of you who watched the run-up to IGF and the World Telecommunications the World Conference on International Telecommunications, will see that there is an international component to all this. What's coming up next is the World Conference on Telecom Policy. Before that, there was a World Telecommunications Standards Alliance meeting. There will be the plenipotentiary meeting of the ITU. All of these are ITU bodies. And I think it was very instructive to observe this WICET meeting where there was, for the first time, a really severe schism. 89 countries voted to, or shouldn't they voted, but decided to sign the treaty, and 55 countries didn't. And I'm very pleased that the United States did not sign it, partly on the grounds that the language in the international telecom regulations as modified introduced language that brought applications and content into the debate. Never in the past history of the ITRs has content ever been an issue. It's almost as if had this discussion been in the context of telephony, those words would have suggested we can interfere with your ability to say what you want to say on the telephone, and I think all of us would react pretty negatively to that. There's no reason why we should be restricted as to what we can say on the internet either to first order. And yet that's what was proposed. And so this expansion of authority was resisted by quite a few countries. Nonetheless, the damage has been done. And by this I mean that any country that has signed that treaty and chooses to exercise severe restraints on what people can say and what they can do with the internets in their countries will turn to that treaty and say, don't look at me, I'm following the international regulations. So don't blame me if you think this is a human rights violation. I'm following what was agreed in Dubai in December. This is not a good outcome. So I think that that is still going to be with us as time goes on. We have the other meetings coming up, the telecom policy meeting, the plenipotentiary, where the ITU is free to rewrite its work plan to add new things. And as if you've been following, you know that they kept creeping into the internet space since the other space is evaporating, right? Telephony has moved over into the internet, video has moved over into the internet, pretty much everything has moved over into that technology. Well, on the international front, in addition to things like WICET and so on, there's the TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, some of you, how many remember ACTA? Quite a few people. You remember that that was the Anti-Counterfeiting and Trademark Act, which was defeated in large measure because a lot of very brave European countries said no. TPP has similar kinds of potential in it, and I think, once again, it behooves us to look very carefully at what language is in there. And it's getting somewhat difficult to find out because a lot of those negotiations don't take place in a transparent way. I'd like to shift gears for just a second because there is, as you know, a continuing debate about cybersecurity. This is not a silly debate. There are real serious harms that can take place in the internet, whether it's essentially commandeering your computer to become part of a botnet, which then is used to either do denial of service attacks or generate spam or do other kinds of things, or possibly obtaining access to your machine and then doing key logging and other things of that sort. Those are real problems. They are serious problems, and we shouldn't ignore them. The question is what to do about them. And so often the term security, especially cybersecurity, tends to swiftly lump itself into the same discussion with national security. Now, I'm not comfortable with this easy slide from cybersecurity to national security. And in consequence of this discomfort, and I'm going to come back to why that makes me uncomfortable, I want to introduce another meme, and I may have mentioned this the last time I was here. Safety is a really interesting term because we all want to feel and be safe in the internet. We want to feel that when we go out and use applications, when we go to websites, that it's reasonable that we would be safe and not infected by our use of the system. We all know that you can go to a website, and everybody who knows even a little bit about the World Wide Web knows how browsers work. They go out to the network and they download the home page and then they interpret it. Now, years ago, when Tim Berners-Lee did his early web design, most of the stuff that was in HTML format was images, formatting stuff, and text, and that was it. That's pretty innocuous. I mean, you download that and you try to interpret it to make a nice magazine-like presentation on the page. The trouble is, in 2013, when you download that home page, it's got Java or JavaScript or Python or other high-level languages, which are interpreted by the browser. Now, depending on the browser's design, depending on the level of privilege it is given by the operating system, the execution of those high-level languages might actually store malware on your machine, alter the operating system, or do other kinds of significant damage, often surreptitiously. So now the question is what to do about that. And in one instance, there's an organization which I chair called Stop Badware. It's a not-for-profit which will respond to complaints about websites that have become infected. Some of you will know that when Google does the indexing of the internet, our software also tries to identify whether there is malware on the site. Now, anyone with a little bit of computer science background knows that a program trying to figure out what another program is doing is actually an impossible task. There's some Turing halting problems hiding in there. But nonetheless, we do our best to recognize that there might be malware on the site. And if there is, we make a note of that. And if you use the Google search engine and one of the destinations happens to be one of those potentially infected sites, we pop up this big red page saying, we don't think you should go there. There may be malware that will harm your computer or cause other damage. Now, you can still go there. We don't stop you, but we try to warn you. Now, of course, the people who run those websites are almost invariably absolutely insulted by the possibility that we've accused them of housing malware or badware on their sites. And so they call and complain. We send them to Stop Badware, which does an in-depth analysis of that target site. And generally speaking, I don't know that the statistics are 100%. I'm sure they aren't. But they're very, very high fraction of the cases there really is malware there. It's not that the website operator put it there. In fact, most of them didn't. It's because their own security is so crappy that somebody else got in and put the malware on that site. So Stop Badware helps them clean that out. Now, there's a certain recidivism rate here, and in fact, that would be a statistic that's worth looking at. But the idea here is that we, among others, would like to make the network a safer place to be. And I'd like to have that meme, this notion of cyber safety, part of our vocabulary to offset the tendency to slide into national security rhetoric. Let me give you a metaphor, which, like all metaphors, is a little weak. But let's suppose that your house is burning down and you're standing there with a garden hose and you realize, I need somebody with a bigger hose and more water. And so what do? Well, you don't call the police department, you call the fire department because they have big hoses and more water and their job is to put the fire out. There are an awful lot of people and businesses in the United States and elsewhere that are not prepared to protect themselves from various kinds of attack, just like you and I are not really prepared to put out a serious house fire with a garden hose. So we need a fire department to call, a cyber fire department. We don't have one today, and the analogy is, I'll give you some examples of why this analogy isn't perfect, but I think that we should be thinking about institutions that actually help the rest of us recover from some of these potential hazards. Big companies like Google and others have the ability to defend themselves. We have the skill sets, we have the capacity in order to fight back. But small businesses and individuals like you and me don't necessarily have that capability. So we need some place to call. Interestingly enough, the fire department analogy has a couple of interesting features to it. One of them is they come and put the fire out. The second thing is that after the fire is out, they try to figure out how it started. If it turns out that there's evidence that this is arson, then they turn it over to the police department or maybe even the FBI, depending on circumstances. So, and the third thing the fire department does, they'll come out and inspect the house or the building or whatever, your office, to see whether or not it meets code or whether there are things that you could do to make it safer. Well, I can imagine a cyber fire department having roles like that. Now, there's an open question. Who would pay for that? And I don't know the answer to this yet. But we treat this as a civic responsibility, and there are taxes that go to some fire departments. Others are volunteer. I guess I'm a little edgy about having volunteer cyber fire departments because we don't know whether the people who have volunteered are actually putting out fires or starting them. I sometimes feel that way about the antivirus companies, and I hope I haven't insulted anybody, but it's just a little nightmare in my own head. But I want you to also consider that this notion of critical infrastructure, which is a common term that's used a lot, it's even showing up in legislative language, that this term, critical infrastructure, tends to be interpreted as the power generation systems, the transportation systems, and the other major infrastructures that we do rely on. I don't disagree with their being critical. The thing that I find sort of unsatisfying about that focus of attention is that you and I, with our laptops and desktops and mobiles, are part of this nation's economy. And what we do and what we are vulnerable to has an effect. In fact, some of the cyber attacks, especially the spear phishing attacks, start by going after an individual, figuring out how to break into their email or their social networking sites and other things, and then use that as leverage to get deeper and deeper into the system until finally they get to the target that they're after. Sometimes it could be very indirect. You can imagine someone trying to figure out, okay, how do I break into company X? Well, let me get on LinkedIn and find out who is associated with company X. What can I do to ingratiate myself? How do I get, and can I get 2 or 3 hops into the system? Would you please introduce me to so-and-so? You can imagine a sequence of events where the initial interactions look pretty innocuous, but the target is elsewhere. So these possibilities and these kinds of scenarios are not unreal. So I think we're part of the critical infrastructure too, although I'm shy away from saying that overly loudly, because if being labeled cyber infrastructure or something means a whole bunch of obligations, costs, and other kinds of constraints and restrictions, that might not be what we're looking for. But if we don't think of ourselves as part of the important cohort in this cyber ecosystem, then we're actually forgetting that a lot of the penetrations take place going through us and not through some of the other more obvious front doors. I think one of the important things that we can all undertake, and Google, I think we've tried very hard to do this, is to expose what's going on in the world in terms of attempts to suppress, in terms of attempts to pull information from companies about users and individuals and what they are doing. I'm sure that over the course of the last day and a half or two that China has come up. They're not the only parties that are interested in what's going on in the net. There are others, including some that are domestic, that I think are equally interested. The idea here is that we'd like to make that more visible, because the more transparent it is, the more light you shine, the harder it's going to be to do some of these things surreptitiously. And that's why we have a transparency report at Google, where we try to say, here are the countries that have asked for information, asked to suppress information and the like, and this is how we've responded to them. We could use a lot more of that. Although I think from some of the brief remarks I heard earlier as I got in, and I'm guessing at others that may have been made in the last day or two, visibly exposing some of this stuff puts you in jeopardy in some countries in the world. So I mean, we need to be conscious of that. Which brings me to another point, and that has to do with anonymity. I am still a believer that anonymity is, in fact, an important feature. A lot of people don't agree with that. Their argument is you can say a lot of really bad things, some of which may not be true, as an anonymous party and cause a lot of harm. And I don't actually disagree with that point. On the other hand, it's also true that in some parts of the world, if you are not anonymous and you say something that should be said, you may be in jeopardy, and we heard some of that earlier in the videos that were shown. So I have these funny, almost schizophrenic view about anonymity. I recognize that it's potentially a hazard, but I also recognize its importance. And this leads me to an interesting speculation about what I'll call strong authentication. All of you are probably familiar with the evolution of public key cryptography since 1977. It's gotten pretty sophisticated. One of the interesting features of public key crypto is that you need 2 keys. One you can treat as public and one you treat as private. And as long as you never release the private key, you have this very interesting asymmetric capability. If you publish your private or your public key, then someone can communicate with you securely by encrypting things in your public key, and only you can decrypt them. If, on the other hand, you want somebody to know it was you that sent something, you can encrypt something in your private key and send it out, and if it can be decrypted with your public key, which you've made public, other people know it must have come from you. So that's digital signing. And so this interesting symmetry of confidentiality and digital signing is a very powerful tool. So let me give you kind of a little scenario to show you how it might be possible to build up quite a powerful security and authentication system starting from almost nothing, except for the premise that public key cryptography works. And here I'm pretending that key sizes are big enough to protect us for quite a long time, not counting the possibility of quantum computing, in which case it's time for us to go off and look for a different crypto method than using factoring of prime numbers. And if anybody with any brain who's working in this space knows that that's a threat, and they're going to have to go find some new crypto ideas. But let's imagine that David and I are interacting with each other. We don't know each other. And I get a message from David saying, "Hi, I'm David, and here's my public key." So my first thought is, well, let's see if he has a private key to go with it. So I generate a random number, and I encrypt it in his public key, which he's just given to me, which he should be able to decrypt with his private key. And I say, "Hi, I'm Vint, and here's my public key." So David decrypts the random number and then sends it back to me encrypted in my public key, which I then decrypt. And I verify that David must have a private key that works because he decrypted the number, re-encrypted it in my public key. And I send that number back to David, so he now knows that I have a public and private key pair as well that work. Okay, now at this point, all we know is that there's a guy named David and a guy named Vint, and they each have public keys. End of story. Well, and they're private keys to go with. That's all we know. We have no idea who we are. On the other hand, if later David sends another message saying, "Hi, it's David again, and here's my public key," or maybe he just says, "Hi, it's David again," and I say, well, let's see if it's the same David. So I generate a random number encrypted in his public key, and we go back and forth again. Now, David and Vint know that they're still talking to the same David and Vint, unless, of course, the private key has been compromised. So, or something's been broken. I mean, but let's assume for a moment that everything else is okay. At this point, we now have established a way of communicating with each other, which need not necessarily be confidential, but could be. But in any case, it has the high probability that it's the same parties interacting with each other. Now, later, David says, "Hi, it's David again, and I want to borrow $50,000. All of a sudden, I think I want to know more about David than his first name and his public key. So I send a message to David saying, "Dear David, do you have a job? Do you have any assets? What's your credit rating? And where do you live? How do I find you again in case things go wrong?" And David sends this long thing back to me, and I look at it, and it looks pretty good, except what if he's lying? So now I have the problem of, oh, I'm sorry, there's that. I could say, "David, you need to tell me all this stuff." He could say, "No, I won't tell you that," and I'll say, "Fine, the conversation's over." Or he sends the material to me, and I say, "I wonder if he's lying," and I go find a third party that I trust who can validate David's statements. And if, in fact, I trust the party, they validate David's statements, then maybe I will seriously consider loaning him $50,000. Of course, what they may send back is that he's a deadbeat, and I'll say, "Sorry, David, I can't do that." But the idea here is that we built up this capability to communicate in a fairly reliable way without knowing much about each other. And only at the point where both of us decide we need to know more, we agree to exchange that information. We're not forced to do that. There are some places in the world that want to force you to identify yourself absolutely by identity before you can even get on the net. You hear about things like internet driver's licenses and things of that sort. This leads me to one other observation, which is that identity and identifiers are not the same thing. And many people conflate them. I think it's perfectly okay to have a pseudonym, maybe more than one pseudonym, and to use that in any way you wish. But what's important is that you don't have to turn that into identity unless and until you want to. And if a party insists on that, you can decide, do I want to give that information, or do I not want to avail myself of whatever the product or service happens to be? So I think that we have some work to do in trying to make sure that we use public key crypto, identity and identifiers, and pseudonymity in ways that are both creative and give maximum flexibility to the users of the system. I just have a couple more points to make. One of them has to do with open source. This is not a panacea, but it's certainly a very nice way of at least showing people what is it that they're getting. Now, some people will say, well, you can look at the open source, but what if they also give you a binary compiled copy? How do we know the two are the same? There's a whole bunch of questions like that. But on the presumption that people are being fairly straight about all this, having the ability to take open source, modify it if you like, compile it, and place it on a platform is a pretty powerful tool for several reasons. One of them is that it allows for evolution. Now, it doesn't have to be totally open-ended evolution either. In the case of Google's Android and the Chrome browser, we manage open source software, and we release instances of it with very silly names like ice cream sandwich and so on. The important thing here is that you don't necessarily have to use our releases. You're free to take the source code and change it if you want to. On the other hand, if there's a kind of a track on which this thing is evolving, if you start making changes to the source code, you have to go back and reintegrate any of the changes in. That could be somewhat tricky. The thing that's important is you get to see what the software is that you're using. And I think that's powerful. In fact, to give you another analogy that you'll recall, in the very earliest days of browsers, one of the things that was interesting about them is that if you asked, you could see the source code, the HTML of the web page that you were looking at. Now, this had a very interesting consequence. People would see web pages that they thought were really cool, and they could go look at the source and then replicate that or copy and change and modify. The webmaster didn't exist until people started learning from each other. And this powerful mutual reinforcement has led to a lot of the World Wide Web's fluid evolution over time. So this idea of keeping things open has a lot of powerful side effects. It allows people to develop software and other applications in a way that progresses more rapidly than keeping things secret. I have to say that as I look at the patent wars, especially the software patent wars, I'm very dismayed because the HTML story of the web is an example why patenting software is not a wonderful idea. I haven't been a big fan, and I'm hoping that there will be some serious reconsideration, especially given that the Patent and Trademark Office is not well suited or even well positioned to assess whether a piece of software is in fact brand new or whether it in fact is something that's been known for a long time. I know that whenever I used to make a living writing software, if I had a problem that I had seen before and I knew there was a program that would solve that problem, I tended to use it. And I suppose that was 30 years ago. In today's world, doing that might actually get me and my company in a whole lot of trouble in case somebody had gone off and patented an idea inappropriately, but nonetheless is holding the reins to do that. So open source is a good thing. I think I want to come back to cybersecurity for just a second. I think it's fair for us to not only recognize but also admit that there are national scale attacks that are taking place. I think some of the revelations coming out of Mandiant, for instance, I thought were pretty persuasive as to the source of many of the attacks against American companies. But you can imagine that we're not the only targets in the world. So that is going on, and we do have to find ways of responding. The reason that I get worried about this is, of course, espionage is a big deal. It's a big business. And it allows people to take advantage of R&D that they didn't pay for and compete with you and not have to pay the cost of that research. But what I worry about is when we drift into this cybersecurity and national security dialogue, I get worried that we will get trigger happy. And the thing that I worry the most about is called attribution. The question is, if you think you were attacked, who done it? And it isn't always clear. In fact, false flag attacks are potentially extremely dangerous, especially in the context of someone saying, I consider this to be a national attack against the United States or against country X, and I feel free to respond any way I wish. I could respond with a cyber counterattack. Maybe I would use conventional weapons to attack. What if I decided to go nuclear? This is terrifying, because if you had a false flag attack and you went after the wrong party, the consequences could be absolutely devastating. But even a cyber counterattack could be hazardous. Now, I'm not saying, therefore, we shouldn't do any of these things. I think what I'm saying is better think really hard about what we're doing before we do anything. Example on the cyber counterattack. Suppose you conclude that there are 10 million machines in the United States that are attacking American businesses run by some botnet general. And so we decide we're going to counterattack against all those machines. Well, they're your machines and my machines, right? And so, yeah, we're going to wipe out their disk drives. Well, this is called collateral damage in some places. The trouble is that collateral damage could destroy the very cyber infrastructure that we're depending on. That's because you and I are part of that infrastructure. What we do every day counts. And having our machines destroyed because they've been taken over by somebody we didn't know anything about is not a good outcome. So again, the vocabulary and the debate over this cyber security in the national sense, I think leads me to be quite concerned about when and how such weapons are exercised. Now, I wanted to end on two different notes. The first one is a kind of positive note. Although I'm not at liberty to suggest any details here, I want you to understand that there are more potential pieces of infrastructure to grow the internet and to rest it on top of than are presently available. One purely technical example of this is the reconsideration of the way in which we use radio. Most of us are familiar with the idea of slicing up the radio frequency spectrum into tiny little pieces and saying, you have exclusive use of that piece of the spectrum for this purpose. You purchased at auction this chunk of the radio frequency spectrum and you can do these things with it. The trouble is, radio is a lot more interesting than that. And if you hang around at the FCC Technology Advisory Committee, like I do from time to time, one of the debates which is slowly emerging is to say, wait a minute, for all these years, we have been trying very, very hard to constrain transmitters from radiating outside of their spectrum band or their frequency band because we have crappy receivers out there that don't know how to reject the signal. I mean, for all practical purposes, we're still in 1916 with people with crystal radios that receive the whole spectrum. So if we build smart receivers, we can not only reject transmissions that we shouldn't be interested in, but we can do spectrum sharing in a way that could not be done before. There are little bits and pieces of that, and some of you may be using mobile phones that do that now, CDMA being a good example, code division multiple access with direct sequence spreading, is a way of taking a broader band signal and hiding it below the noise level, or at least very low signal level. The receivers collapse that signal by signal processing to figure out, oh, that's for me, not for somebody else. This is just one example of a variety of modulation schemes that we can think of. You know about FM and AM, but there's also things that the CDMA, the direct sequence spreading, frequency hopping, polarization, and a bunch of other possibilities. These radio waves are really interesting little critters. I mean, they propagate in very, very interesting ways. We're not taking advantage of any of that. What I would love to see happen is in the US that there is a serious effort to look at very, very new ways of modulating radio signals so that we can start using the spectrum better. If you sit out somewhere in an urban area with a radiometer, over a broad, listening to a broad range of frequencies, you discover that the radio spectrum on average is used less than 2%, which means that we have a factor of 50 potentially available to us to increase our access to and use of radio transmission. We just aren't doing it because of the way in which we manage the allocation and use of spectrum. If it were up to me, I would never do another auction. Instead, I would say, you know, it's a one-shot. It's like a kid in the candy store, you know, gobbles up all the candy, and he has one day of bellyache, and then it's the end of that's it. If you do open spectrum, like we did with Wi-Fi, think of how much money was generated in GDP growth and taxation from all the applications and products that went along with Wi-Fi. It's a very good example of something that could be replicated if we just put our heads on right. Too many people are too eager to make, you know, a few gigabucks now without realizing that over the long term they could make a few terabucks. So that's one thing. I think that we are on the edge of being able to do a much better job of using the spectrum. And finally, my last point, the war isn't over and the battle has not been won, or it was the other way around. The war has not been won and the battle isn't over. We must continue to fight for openness on the internet. And with your help, we will succeed. Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, I leave it to you to decide whether everybody wants to run away, or wants to have a discussion, or get rid of coffee, or whatever it is that you have in mind. What would you like to do?
Well, what do you want to do? Peter, come on over here. Vint, you know Peter Cochran, right?
I do indeed.
Okay. Just a little bit. Just a little.
Vint, how do you feel about having Yeah. Oh, okay. I'd like to know how you feel about having a code auction as opposed to a bandwidth auction. We got awful close, as I understand it, in the FCC, to just letting loose and saying, do what you like, so long as you're not interfering and causing a problem, we don't mind. And I've kind of got that situation around my home with Ofcom, where I've installed a number of things that, strictly speaking, are illegal, but I don't cause interference with people, and so they're not all that worried. It's all low-powered stuff. But I got engaged with a study of Chicago about 15 years ago, and you know, Chicago's a really heavy user of radio, but nowhere in the city you could find any more than 17% usage of any bands. If you looked across the whole of the sort of DC to 3 gigs or so, it was pretty empty. And I would just like to let loose. Let's just back off on all regulation and see what happens, because I think you could make quite a big improvement on the use of the spectrum. But I rather favour charging phone companies for the codes they use and letting the little guys in for free.
So first of all, Peter, I'm going to have a question at the end of my response for you, so don't go away from the microphone. I don't know whether we are prepared to do something as cold turkey as that, but I would certainly advocate for taking a chunk of spectrum which is not in the commercial sector at all, for spectrum that's owned by the military or government or something, and starting to conduct a series of demonstrations that show exactly what's possible in terms of sharing and in terms of utilization. So although my heart is with you, my head tells me that may be a little much to try to sell. But if we can start demonstrating what's possible, it opens up an interesting market for products and certainly an interesting market for services, and also potential for generating new revenues from new businesses. Now, the question I have for you, Peter, I'm moving to London in June. And I need to know, not necessarily in this forum, but later, what in the hell am I, looking forward to in London in terms of what's available in terms of high-speed networks and all the other kinds of things. I've heard various and sundry stories about your former employer, and we almost got married. It turns out I was at MCI and he was at BT.
We were betrothed, I think.
Yes, we were. Yeah, that marriage didn't work out. Yeah. Anyway, I'd like to take that up with you offline, if I could. I'm looking forward to my 6 months there. It satisfies my wife's serious case of Downton Abbey disease. Okay, thank you.
Why are you moving to London?
Why am I moving to London? Well, it turns out that, as you might imagine, there is a lot of policy debate going on in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa, for that matter. And rather than flying back and forth from Washington, it looked a lot easier to go in and out of London. And so I decided I would devote that 6 months, the last half of the year, to policy issues in that part of the world. The EU is still conflicted, self-conflicted, when it comes to privacy versus security, for example. And there are crazy ideas like Hadopi and this other one, the right to forget. The people want to be. This is sort of like looking in the mirror and deciding you don't like what you see in the mirror, and then you try to fix the mirror. You know, they think you got to fix the thing that's reflected. They would. My reaction right now. I wanted to say this to the French president, but I didn't. Mr. President, if you really want to forget, join the French Foreign Legion. That's what it was all for. But I bit my tongue.
Can I say
Okay.
one thought? I've seen a couple of cases where illegal operators have been using satellite transponders, and the only reason they were found out was that the noise floor gradually came up, and then
Yes.
they had to do something. But if we were to take something like 30 gigs and above and just call it the Wild West, do what you like, I think it could be really kind of empowering. It's incredibly difficult to cause problems in those frequencies with other people, and everything's going for you. The phase noise of the transmitters and the receivers you don't care about because you've got lots of bandwidth to waste. I'll just seed that with you because I think we should put that in. I've tried it with Ofcom, but they're not going to do anything, I don't think. But we should try that with the FCC because it's not going to hurt anybody and it could free up an awful lot of space.
Well, actually, I would, let's see, I'll see your 30 gigahertz and raise you 30 to go up to 60. And the
Yep.
reason 60 gigahertz is so interesting is, first of all, this thing dissipates after about a half a mile because it's right in the oxygen absorption band of the atmosphere. And so you really can't interfere for very much because it just gets absorbed. Anyway, this is obviously very geeky. We'll to be continued.
I'll see you later and I'll see you in London, okay.
Okay. We have other,
Hi.
over there, all right.
Who are you?
Bill Ottman with Minds.com. So I'm curious about the potential of making more Google code free and open source and potentially decentralizing the Google network. I know a lot of people are craving something like that.
So one of the most interesting speculations is whether or not it's possible to either adapt the internet or invent something else that has no centralization at all. I mean, today there is centralization in the allocation of IP addresses and domain names in order to avoid duplication. But there are some interesting potential ideas that might allow for a much more distributed design. Sergey Brin wandered into a meeting that I was hosting on something called delay and disruption, DTN, delay and disruption tolerant networking, which happened to be for the purposes of designing and building an interplanetary extension of the internet. But he came in to say, why don't you think about using that kind of technology, which is highly robust in the face of hostile interference and loss of connectivity and things like that. Why don't you think about whether that would be a platform in order to build a network which has no centralization whatsoever. It achieves its uniqueness by other means. So the answer is you should really seriously think about that. I don't know that open source is necessarily the only way to get there. In fact, internet didn't start with open source initially, but it did start with open protocols. Those were fully documented and made available without any patenting or copyright control, which is very deliberate, by the way. But Bob Kahn and I knew that that was a better way to proceed than anything else. But certainly, open source eventually, in the form of Unix and the TCP/IP on the Berkeley release, sure helped a lot. To say nothing of Ethernets and things of that sort and workstations. But I would encourage you to really think seriously about what the architecture would look like. I believe that that's achievable, but we have some hard problems to solve, especially if we want to also increase the security of the system and ability to resist various forms of attack.
Sure.
Okay, I have a gentleman over here.
So my name is Chris Segoyan. I work for
Chris.
ACLU. Hi. So this week there's a big security conference in Canada, in Vancouver, called CanSec West. And Google goes in full force every year, and you actually have this great contest called Ponium, where your engineers offer bounties for security vulnerabilities in Google's products. And
Right, you were going to ask about the guy that found one and didn't want to accept
let me
the
ask the question
$60,000
first.
prize. Okay.
Let me ask the question.
All right.
So you guys up the price every year,
Yeah.
and Google should be commended because Microsoft doesn't offer bounties, Apple doesn't offer bounties. Google has put these financial incentives in place for developers who find security flaws to do the right thing.
Right.
Right, and I think maybe this year it's $40 or $50 or $60,000. Last year there was a French company that said that they wouldn't give a vulnerability to Google in Google Chrome because they wouldn't give it to you guys for $1 million because they could sell it more on the open market.
That's right.
So the question is this: Google is currently competing to purchase flaws in Google's products with DoD and DoD contractors and military contractors in other countries. And I think it's reasonable to assume that Google will never, in fact, be able to outbid the Defense Department, even with the sequester. And to date, the only people from Google who've really said much about the existence of this market or the role that Google plays in this have been engineers on the Chrome security team who have said not very nice things about the people who are buying the flaws or selling the flaws. And I'm wondering, as an executive on stage in a very nice suit, if you have any similar thoughts about the existence of people who are buying flaws and brokering flaws in your products that are not ultimately designed to make your products more secure, but to facilitate hacks into consumers using your products.
That's absolutely correct. And it turns out, first of all, I don't know whether I should accept the compliment for the suit or not. I've been wearing suits in Washington for 37 years now, specifically three-piece suits. So that's just part of my shtick. Second, no software that I have ever encountered has been free of bugs. There might be some small pieces that you could convince yourself actually do what they're supposed to do, but when it gets to the kind of complexity of a Chrome or an Android or something like that, or an operating system, it's very hard to avoid them, partly, well, for a lot of different reasons. So the question is, well, what to do? And we, of course, spend a great deal of time internally trying to make sure we don't send out buggy software. But our software has had bugs too, and I don't know that we can stop that. I don't know what else that we should do, but I can say that it's annoying, but it's a practical observation that there are people who wish to exploit those and would not, as you just gave a perfect example of that they are not interested in telling us what those bugs are because they want to use them or sell them. All I can say is that even knowing that there is a bug of some kind can be helpful, just knowing its existence. But you need to, if you don't know anything about the nature of the bug, it makes it pretty hard to find. So I think, let me give you an example of a controversial thought which I have expressed and some people have attacked. I think about people writing software for a living, and I think about what they should know in order to write software which is less subject to infiltration. And I reached the conclusion that we should actually be teaching these guys how malware works.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And maybe even getting them to learn how to write the malware. Because if they don't understand how this works, how in the hell are they going to defend against it? And some people have said, oh my God, if you teach people about malware, you'll be creating a terrorist collection. I'm sitting here saying, if we don't teach them about it, then the bad guys will keep exploiting the software. So that's one point. The second one has to do with hardware and software working together. Years ago at MIT, there was a project called Multi-Access Computing, Project Mac. And in the course of pursuing this multi-access time-sharing work, the guys at MIT modified a Honeywell 635 to become a Honeywell 645. The modification involved virtual memory, and also 8 rings of, let me call it, security protection. Those little rings of protection were states that your program could be in. If you were in state 0, in the middle, the most powerful state, you could execute any instruction on the machine. If you were at ring 8, there were a series of things you weren't allowed to do, and you had to get permission to move from one ring to another. by trying to execute an instruction which you didn't have permission for, it would trap to a little kernel piece of software that asked, who are you and why do you think you can execute this instruction? This joining together of hardware and software turned out to be pretty powerful. The x86 chips have had those capabilities, but people have not been programming to use them. And it's my belief that it's time now to join software and hardware together to mutually reinforce security. The digitally signed BIOS is an example of that kind of thing that doesn't allow you to execute the bootstrap unless the digital signature checks out, or you can't update the bootstrap unless the digital signature checks out. Now, there's a little undertone there where you have to figure out who has the right to sign the bootstrap, because now that person is really controlling what operating systems can be run on that particular platform. But this notion of making hardware and software reinforce each other, I think is at least one path forward to making systems more secure and possibly removing angles of attack on vulnerabilities that might otherwise go undetected.
I mean, to just quickly clarify, I guess my question really was about the fact that the largest players in the market, the largest people buying the vulnerabilities, are within 100 miles of this room. What do you think about that?
So actually, I don't know that for a fact. And so honestly, I just don't have any. I'm not saying you're not correct. I'm just saying literally I don't know that that's who they're selling to. For all I know, they may be selling to other folks who are not part of the intelligence community, but may be part of the criminal community, but I just don't know.
Correct.
Okay, we got one over there.
Hi, Vint. It's only Jerry Nelson. We've just had an excellent question about zero-day vulnerabilities. A zero-day vulnerability is one which is not known to the public or the writer of the software, so that it can be incorporated into a zero-day exploit against which there will be no immediate defense. My question is kind of a follow-up for that. I assume we all agree that the United States government has sponsored cyber attacks on other entities.
So it's a really interesting question. It raises the same somewhat disturbing point that the U.S. is the only country in the world that has used nuclear weapons against another country.
Well, we're not the only country to do this, but we have done it. And my question is, don't you think it should be an objective of the people of this country to urge our government not to engage in any offensive cyber attacks? Because this country is inherently vulnerable and for decades to come will remain one of the most vulnerable countries to such attacks itself.
So actually, I'm sorry.
Well, there are good reasons and bad reasons for that. The good reasons are we're very advanced. We use a lot of technology. Unfortunately, some of it is quite old and went in a long time ago. SCADA is an example of that. The bad reason is that we have corporations who are not forced to be liable for the economic damage their buggy software causes, and so there's no economic incentive for them to do a better job of writing better software. But in any event, we shouldn't attack because we can't defend. Would you agree?
So, well, let me go back to your first question, which is, should we tell the country or the leadership not to do any cyber attacks? On what sounded to me like your reasoning was, if we didn't do that, then the other guys wouldn't. And I don't think you meant that, because it's pretty clear if we are vulnerable because of our heavy reliance on software and networking and so on, this is well known, and whether we do or don't use offensive cyber methods, they will be used against us, and they are being used against us. So I don't think that equation would balance.
But you mentioned the comment that we dropped.
I'm sorry, back to the microphone if you want to respond.
I accept all that you've just said, but you yourself mentioned our dropping the atomic bomb. There were physicists who urged us to drop it out in the bay. It would have made a great splash. It would have made the point.
Well,
so we did not take the morally highest road possible in that case. We would have had a far different, I speculate, arms race had we taken the morally higher road. Well, there are more advantages to taking the higher road here in the 21st century.
So the problem with this kind of discussion, of course, is that we're looking at alternate histories, and neither of us really could be sure what the outcome would have been. Would it have been sufficient or not? And honestly, I don't know. In this other case, because it's clear that we are already under attack from offensive sources, that we do have to find ways of responding. And it's, I think it's an unfortunate but probably practical and realistic observation that if we deny ourselves the ability to respond offensively, we may not be able to contain the damage. The problem is that we don't have adequate defensive resources right now, for all the reasons that we've been talking about. The technology to defend ourselves is still weak. I would much prefer, this is sort of like having the moral equivalent of Iron Dome in the software world would be pretty attractive, but I don't know that we know how to do that yet. I would love to see more investment in research exactly in that direction. One more.
Vint, Don Means, Gigabit Libraries Network. You've spoken in the past about the problem of losing track of digital media, content, so-called bit rot. Wondering if you've been thinking about that more and if you've come up with any actual, perhaps implementable solutions.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the short story is that every time we use an application that produces some complex file, that we are investing time and energy in creating a bunch of bits, and that if we preserve the bits very carefully and we move them from one medium to another, as you know, the 5 1/4 inch floppies turn into the 3 1/2, to turn into the CDs and the DVDs and so on, we keep the bits around. But if we can't keep the software running that knows how to interpret the bits, then the bits might just as well be rotten. And the thing that, to answer your question, the short answer is this is really an uphill battle to try to find a way to preserve the meaning of the bits. And one path is to try to create standards that we hope would be persistently observed over hundreds of years, because that's really the time frame that I'm thinking here is not 5 years or 10 years, but it's hundreds of years or even thousands of years. I mean, when you see a 1,000-year-old vellum manuscript and you can still read it, assuming you know how to read Greek and Latin, it's pretty stunning. And then you think about the CD that had your 1997 PowerPoint on it that isn't interpretable with the 2010 version of PowerPoint. And I'm sorry, that wasn't a gratuitous dig at Microsoft. I mean, this is a problem for everyone. The software that you run now to create content is not guaranteed to continue to work on every new operating system. It's not even guaranteed to continue to work with each new version. Sometimes it's not backwards compatible. So that's the origin of the bit rot question. There are maybe two, possibly three paths forward. One of them is to try to adopt standards that you think have a reasonable longevity. PDFA is an attempt at that. I'm not too happy with that, but for things which are statically represented, that could be printed, in other words, this is not too bad as a tool. The trouble is that an awful lot of the things that we create now are not static. They're very dynamic. If it's a spreadsheet that has to be interpreted to be useful, or it's a video game, or it's some other interactive application that lets us analyze complex data sets, these things are not static, and therefore we need to preserve the software itself. And this is leading me to conclude that the cloud might actually help as a platform. We might be able to run older operating systems through emulation. We might be able to run older applications, again, on those emulated machines and emulated operating systems. Now, the problem will be getting the right to do that, because some of the things that we might be executing, an operating system or an application, might have intellectual property rights associated with it. And we might have some problems getting the right to run them in this emulated environment, especially if the company has gone out of business or the company has stopped supporting a particular version of application software. It seems to me that as much as I am unhappy with the intellectual property community, there may be a place where it's worth engaging, and that's on trying to establish a regime that says when conditions change and the applications are no longer available to interpret bits that I have invested in, then I should have a right to be able to use that software. So I'm sure I didn't say that very well, but the idea here is that we should create this notion of preservation as an important part of our regulatory regime. Because if we don't do that, seriously, the people in the 22nd century will be wondering about us, because none of the bits that we have that record our lives and our thoughts and everything else will be interpretable by them. So that's sort of the direction that I've been heading in: standardization, emulation, and an intellectual property regime that supports the notion of preservation.
Thanks very much.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, David, so I think we must be done, at least for my part.
I think we must be done with Freedom to Connect 2013.